All right, so we'll go ahead and get started today. Today, we're going to start working with more complex surfaces, and namely, we're going to be working with terrain. This is the first in really a three-part lecture set where we're going to go through, and I'll end up repeating a lot of this process over and over and over again so that I, for lack of a better term, beat it into you so that you'll know how to do this. But this is also leading us into our second assignment where we're going to be working with a piece of topography, and we'll build the components necessary to actually laser cut a model out of this topography. We don't have direct access to the laser cutter because obviously we're on Zoom, so it's not part of the requirement to actually physically build the model, but I want to teach you the strategy behind it. So that being said, we had some technical problems last class, so I didn't quite get to finish some of the rendering tests that I wanted to show. So I went ahead, and to get started today, I went ahead and opened back up where we had left off, so that I can show and follow through with what we were working on. And so this was the same sample file that I had been working with last class, and I do have already saved my red siding folder and the files that I used to create the red siding. So I have my red siding. I have the black and white high contrast version of it that I'll use as my bump map on the texture. And then I have this white to black gradient set up to perform the detail of this particular material. That would be the displacement map. So let's go ahead and build that material. I'm going to open my V-Ray asset editor here. And rather than loading one of the default materials, I'm going to create a brand new generic material. So I'm going to go up to materials here, and I'll choose generic. And we'll call that generic red siding. And there it is. Now, if I open the drawer to the right this time, we have to start building up that material. So this is the same process that I worked on before. So under diffuse here, I'll come over and I'll choose this little checkerboard. And when I choose that checkerboard, I can actually add a bitmap image to it. So there it is. And now I need to find it on my flash drive here. So let's go into my live demonstrations. And there's the bitmap image that I want to load. So I'll use that one. I'll go ahead and click on open. And it's going to bring in this. Now, I didn't do the best job of seaming that together, so we can see a little bit of the seam there, but it'll still work for our purposes. Let me back out, and we can see that the red siding has now been applied. So if I were to take that red siding and apply it to my two sample objects here, I could then go ahead and render it, and we'd get a view with the red siding being applied. Now, remember, this is just a photograph that's been applied. It has no texture on it just yet. And it's probably a little bit easier to see the texture if we zoom in my window here. Why my zoom's not working? I don't know. All right. So let's open back up that V-Ray asset editor. There we go. And under my red siding, I'm now going to look at the bump map. So down here, and I'm looking for that checkerboard again. And this is where I'm going to load in the black and white image that has the texture on it. So we'll go ahead and choose open there. And now I have that black and white high contrast image, and I'm going to start to have some actual texture on it. So let's go ahead and do a render. And we can see that we're starting to get some texture on the surfaces. I should probably up the size of the rendering here. Let me go into my V-Ray settings, and we're going to go to my render output, and I'm just going to bump this up. We'll say maybe this is 1080. Oops, left out a 0 in there. And so now if I were to render it, we'll probably get a little bit higher level of detail, but we can see the texture starting to apply to the boards themselves. Which is good. In this context, though, the boards are still very much flat. We can look along the edge there and see that they're flat. So I could come back and we could open that V-Ray asset editor again. Hold on, let me move my zoom window around here so it's not in front of my screen. Perfect. We'll minimize the frame buffer here, and then we'll load in, come back to our materials. We're working on red siding again, and now we're going to work on the diffuse, or excuse me, the displacement, which is not currently listed. Remember, it's not listed because it's highly render intensive. So we'll add it. There's our displacement map. And we'll go ahead and turn it on. And then let's load in that displacement. So I'll click on this little checkerboard, click on Bitmap, and we'll load in this piece here. And I'll go ahead and say open. That's there. So now we should start to see some actual texture appearing here. Remember, the amount is set based on our default units, which are in inches. So I only want this to be about a ½ inch or so. Maybe it's less than that. Maybe it's a ¼ inch. Let's go ahead and do that rendering and look at what happens. So remember, the speed of the render slows down as soon as we add the displacement map in. And so we're getting a little bit of this slope here. Obviously, it's looking more like tiles, so my value is too high. So we'll have to stop that, and we'll have to adjust it down. So maybe 0.2, and we'll give that a shot and let it render. So we're working through this to try to create our material from scratch. So this is the loading in process that I didn't get to complete last time. Now, one of the interesting things that we can actually do on this is we can eliminate some of the photorealism of it and then change the color of the siding. So I could, for example, once I have this set up here, is I could come in here and under diffuse, I could actually clear the photograph away, but I'm still getting the texture underneath. And then I could change the color to some different color. So I could say, what if I painted the wall in a light blue? Well, I could then stop my render, start my render again. And instead of having the red siding, where I'm using the image as a background, we could add the blue to it as a light blue, and we'd still get the texture on it and our displacement where we have our little lips, and it looks like it's siding, but this time it's blue. So I can actually, once I've created this and I have the bump and I have the texture applied to it, I could actually step away and not even have the original photograph anymore. So in much this same strategy, when I was talking about creating the standing seam metal roof, I created that displacement map only because it's metal. So I could actually create a new generic material. Sorry. And we could call this standing seam metal or metal roof. And on this, I'm only loading the displacement. So let's come in here. Let's load that displacement. Turn it on. And there it is. And I may or may not have to adjust it a little bit. Let's see. We've got that inside. It should, we'll leave it at 1 inch there. Let's change the diffuse color into like a nice dark gray or something like that. And then we could assign it to this object. And we should be able to render it out. Oops, I actually have it backwards. So my seams are going the wrong direction. So let me jump back and make that correction. I think I remember doing that backwards in when I created the image. So let me go into its displacement here. And under our color manipulation, I'm going to invert it. There's my white lines. So now it should stick up. And let's go ahead and render it again.
But why did you use this displacement and not the one that you make from the picture itself?
So I certainly I could, but I didn't have a picture to go from. So I was trying to manually create it. Looks like something went wrong with one of my displacements. Some of these are turning out great, but other ones aren't. There it is, a little bit further away. I don't like the jagged texture. It shouldn't have that. It should be straight, but I'm thinking that something went wrong in my original image. That's why I'm getting those. The point is that we can use these components to build up a material, even if we don't have a photograph, if we understand what the material is doing. That's kind of the point. So anyway, that was the closure of yesterday's or Monday's class. I wanted to make sure that I finished that. But I don't want to spend too much time on it. I want to move on to what we're doing today with terrain. So with terrain, we're actually going to start, and we could do this from a site survey. If we got a site survey from an engineer, we could do it from a site survey. We could do it from a GIS set of like a point cloud or data from a GIS system. What we have easy access to is SketchUp. So we're going to use SketchUp and their geolocation feature to actually pick a piece of terrain. I have not confirmed that SketchUp will work the way it's supposed to just yet. So I did in our, hold on a second. Let me pull up the exercise for today here. And in that, I gave you a sample terrain that's a Hawaii terrain. So if you're struggling to get the SketchUp part, you could download the sample Hawaii terrain and work with that. So it is there available to you in Canvas. But let's go ahead and let's open up SketchUp. I'm not even sure where SketchUp is on this computer. There we go. So we'll agree to the terms. And we'll just use a standard architectural template in inches. Remember, we want to stick in inches because that's what we're going to be working in Rhino. Perfect. I'm going to go ahead and delete this person. We don't need that person coming in with our files. Let me right click on it and say erase. And then all I need to do is go up to the file menu and go to geolocation, add location. So it's file, geolocation, add location. We're going to do very little in SketchUp. Please sign in to use this feature. How nice. So apparently we need a SketchUp account to do this. How nice of them to require that. Let's see if I have one. The online, good question. The online version of SketchUp, I don't believe, has this feature. Give me just a second to look for SketchUp here. I love it when these things load for you. This is so helpful. And this is exactly why I uploaded a sample file for us, just in case. Page isn't working right now. See, this stuff happens to me too. I'll try it one more time just in case. Oh, now it's going to work. All right. What? That's what I have listed as my password. Can't win today. Error has occurred. Let me try it one more time. All right, well, forget it. So I will work on figuring out why this thing doesn't work, but it appears to be above my pay grade right now. So what I have, though, is I have that, you know what, while we're here, let's do the SketchUp.com version, just in case. I don't believe that it has the free version. That's fine. And you can tell that it's been so long since I ever was on it. Why don't we have free? Start modeling. Oh, great. Try it one more time. So I can't even use the free version. How nice. Okay. I'll have to pass. Let's go into Canvas. And I know you guys just love watching me enter passwords, right? Perfect. So let's go into our assignment to 11, or our exercise to 11. And down here at the bottom, there's our Hawaii example terrain. I'm going to right click on it and say save link as. I'm going to save it as a, yeah, we'll leave it as a SketchUp file. And let me put it on my flash drive into a folder for today. Fall of 2022. I almost just wrote fall of 2011. I'm behind here. Okay, remember this stuff happens where it says it can't download securely. I want to make sure I choose keep. Keep anyway, let me download that. Perfect, so that's now saved. That was ultimately what we were trying to get out of SketchUp. I will work on SketchUp. Hopefully by next class, like I said, I'm going to repeat this many times over the next 3 lectures. So you'll see me do it live anyway. We'll use the Hawaii sample terrain today. I'm going to open up Rhino, which I already have here. I need to make sure that I have my large objects inches template chosen. So I'm going to go to File and then New. And I'll choose large object inches. It's important that I'm working in large object inches because that's what SketchUp is going to output my terrain into. Okay. So now it's time to bring that terrain in. And like I said, we could get that from another source. This just happens to be an easy source that we can get to. So I'm going to go to File and then Import. So I'm not choosing Insert this time. I'm using File and then Import. And I will go onto the flash drive and find that SketchUp file that I just saved. And there it is. And then we'll go ahead and click on Open. Now, what SketchUp produces is what's called a mesh. It's a bunch of triangles that are glued together. That's very different than what Rhino does, where it's defined by curves. So we have an infinitely smooth curved surface in Rhino. In SketchUp, we just have a series of triangles that approximate the surface. So all of these options are fine, however. So we'll go ahead and say OK. And we will then get our piece of terrain. So let me jump back here into perspective view. Let me go ahead and delete the person. We don't need the person. We'll zoom back out here. And we can see that I now have a piece of terrain. You can see on this terrain, though, let's switch into shaded mode, that it does, or it is made up with a bunch of individual little triangles. So it's not super smooth, especially on a ridge or on a valley. So it's given us a couple different pieces here. And so if we look at our layers, we have our location layer, but that also contains a sublayer with our objects on it. Let's divide this up a little bit more and let's rename it. So I'm going to double click on location, terrain, and I'm going to say, this is SketchUp. And then I will have a layer for SK flat. That'll be this file. We'll change it onto that layer. And then I'm going to have another layer, sublayer, and we'll call this one SK mesh. And I'm going to take the mesh file right here and put it on that SK mesh layer. That just lets me turn off all of SketchUp later on and work with just this piece of mesh. And then ultimately I'll turn that piece of mesh off. I'm going to type Z for zoom, enter, followed by S for selected, enter. So I'm recentering my view around this object as I start to work with it. And our big task today is that we want to convert this object with all its not smoothness, with all its roughness, into something that's a nice smooth Rhino object. And so this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but we're going to use a command called contour to create contours of this shape. So in order to stay organized, I'm going to start using my layers. Under layer 1 here, I'm going to rename it to be Contour X. And then I will make it the active layer. So I'll change the check mark here so that Contour X is active. And with that layer being active, I'm going to use my contour command. So I'm going to go to curve, curve from objects, and then choose contour. Alternatively, I could type in contour into the command line. There it is. And it's going to ask me to select objects for contours. Well, I want to contour this shape. And I'll go ahead and press enter. And then I want to choose a base point. Now you'll notice that even if I turn my endpoint snap on, I can't actually snap to this because it's not a traditional Rhino object. It's a mesh. So I'm going to have to come down here in my snaps and turn on knot and vertex. And I'll be able to snap to it. So there's vertex and it'll let me snap to it. There we go. So the next thing it asks is the direction perpendicular to the contour planes. So what I want to do here is I want to go off in the X direction without snapping to anything. So I don't want to snap up here to anything. I want to turn on my ortho, move the mouse way over here to the right so I'm not snapping to a single thing, and make sure I'm going along the X axis. Like that. Now, then it's going to ask for the distance between the contours. So we want to pick a distance that's similar to the distance between these little triangles. So I'm guessing this is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 feet. So I'll type in 100 followed by the apostrophe sign, and then I'll go ahead and press enter. And it's going to divide up my terrain into a series of curves. So if I were to turn off my SketchUp mesh, we'd see a whole series of curves that were just generated by basically tracing that terrain. So now I can do the same thing. Let's turn that back on. And I'm going to do the same thing going in the Y direction. So let's rename a layer to be Contour Y. Y. I'll make that the active layer. And then I'll select the mesh again. And I'll go back to curve, curve from objects, contour. I'll pick that vertex corner right there. And this time, instead of going along the X direction, I'm going to go off along the Y direction, like that. I'll click, and I'll keep my distance the same. So it's 100 feet, and I'll go ahead and hit enter, and it will then contour in that direction. So when I'm all done, I should have a series of lines, if I were to turn off the mesh, that go in both directions. And one of the ways that you can confirm that this actually works is if you look at it in the top view. Let's go to zoom, select it in the top view. We should see a perfect grid that just appeared, because that's essentially what we're doing. If you're seeing diagonal lines, something went wrong, and you should go back and do the contour again. One of the other mistakes that I see people make is they enter the next contour, and I'm going to use layer 3 as an example here, is they go right into contour after they've done the first one, and they say, okay, this is great. I'm going to contour right here. I'm going to go on my next axis, and when I hit enter, I get a whole series of dots. That means that I just contoured the lines, which gave me points. So if I'm contouring a surface or a mesh, I'm going to get lines. If I'm contouring lines, I'm going to get points. So we don't want points. That's not what we're after. So instead, we're going to, let me go ahead and delete all those points, and we're going to stick with our lines. So if we did this correctly, like I said, we should have a contour X layer, a contour Y layer. I'll turn off the mesh, and I'll look at this again in the top view. And that's exactly what it should look like. Now we have some problems along the edges because we've got some kind of ragged edges along here. So we need to do some trimming. So I'll use this contour to trim, that's my cutting object, all of those lines like that. I'll hit enter to finish, and then I will need to come back and delete this line here. Then I need to trim along the top here. So we'll take this contour this time. We'll type trim. Helps if I can type. And we'll get rid of all those lines right there. Oops, too many. That was too tight. Let's try it one more time. I may get close and then have to come in here and clean up those last couple. Perfect. So now I have two sides that are perfect. Get rid of that. So this top and this side are perfect. Let's go down here and make sure we can get the bottom set up. We'll use that and we'll trim. And this one's a little bit difficult because we have to kind of be zoomed in to catch all of them. And if for some reason you do this and it's not allowing you to do the curved network, it could have something to do with one of these lines overlapping and not being clean. All right, so that one's now clean. And we'll pick our last one right here. And this is probably the hardest one to do because of the angle. We have to kind of get in here. We may have to manually select a few of these until we get enough space. And we'll come all the way out there. And I was too tight. That was the wrong key command. I was on a Mac. No, I'm on Windows. Try that one more time here. Sorry. Almost there. And there we go. We're nice and clean all the way around. So based on what we've previously done, you probably know where I'm going with this. This is where a curved network goes in to place. So we're going to use that curved network or a network surface to create a brand new surface out of those intersecting contour lines. Now, before we do this, this does have an opportunity to crash. So we're going to save our work. So I'm going to go to File and then Save. And this is important. And so let me put it in my folder for today. And I'll choose Save. Perfect. And I'm going to, again, use layer 3, but this time I'm going to call this layer terrain. So it's active. So now it's time to actually create the surface using the curved network. So depending on the density of curves and the number of curves that you've created, it may throw an error or it may work. So we're going to go ahead, we've saved our work, and let me save it one more time just to make sure. Perfect. So we'll go up to our surface curved network, or I could type in network SRF. It's going to ask me to select the curves in the network, and I'll go ahead and select them all. If you're struggling to actually select them, if it's not working for some reason, one of the alternatives in the curved network is to select all the lines in the X and then select only the outside lines like that. So that's another option if it crashes on you. Ideally, we're going to do it with all of them. So I'll go ahead and select them all. There we go. and I'll go ahead and press enter. It's telling me that I have 130 curves. It's not recommending more than 100. Whatever, let's go ahead and try it. I'll go ahead and say yes. So like I said, this can take a little bit of time, but if it's working, we should fairly quickly get the 4 sides listed, A, B, C, and D. And then we need to wait a little bit longer while it generates the preview. This is where we could get a crash. So if you're doing this, I would wait 2 or 3 minutes before you stop the process and try again. So since I'm doing this live, we have to just wait. Getting there. We should have a little dialog box that pops up very, very soon. While that's working on that, I'm going to see if the SketchUp ever decided to let me log in. Nope, apparently not. So you have to remember when we're creating this, that this is a very, very complex surface. So more detailed and more complicated than anything we've created thus far. And that's not a good sign, but we'll see. Maybe it's coming back. We'll give it just a few more minutes. All right, well, this doesn't seem to want to do it, so I'm going to go ahead and stop it, I hope. This is where I was saying it's important to have a saved copy. So let's go back to our saved copy. Need to close it off of this one. It got back, never mind. So this time, because it didn't work, I'm going to select all of the objects in one direction. So I've selected all of the contour X, and then we'll pick the 2 end curves like that and that. So if we were looking at this in the top view, we would get all of the vertical curves and just the outside top and bottom. So that should allow us to work a little bit faster. And part of that is because when I'm doing it live, I don't want to wait. So let's go ahead and select them all again. I'm holding down Shift to select those 2 there. And then we're going to go back up to Curve Network. So I'm going to go to Surface, Curve Network. And we'll give it a little bit more time. Hopefully it'll work this time. Perfect. Yeah, we got it this time. So all of these default options are fine. We'll go ahead and say okay. And it will then generate the surface. Now, when this happens, the surface becomes incredibly heavy and it'll almost like tank Rhino. And that's because the level of detail on the surface is extremely high. So when it's done, we're going to go ahead and click on the blue object. We'll see if it'll let me click on it right now. Nope, it's still building the curve network, so I have to wait a little bit longer.
What's the difference between two options? The one that you choose only the border, or
the one where you have both the X and the Y together will give you a more accurate surface, but it's probably overkill. So in the interest of time, switching to the single is probably the single axis plus the two end curves will save you the time. And I think this just open file. There we go. There it is. So once it's created the file, it's like this. When I click on it, it'll become this yellow blob. And you can actually see if we zoom in that it's very, very tight in terms of U and V mesh. And we can see the triangles kind of appearing. We don't need anywhere near this level of definition. So the first thing that we'll do is we'll select it like this and go ahead and type rebuild. You can go to edit and then rebuild. And this is where we're going to rebuild the surface into a higher number of points. So I'm going to rebuild it just to start at 200 by 200. And I'll go ahead and say, okay. When I do that, you'll see that the mesh gets, the U and V mesh on the surface gets much less dense, but it's still plenty to see our overall terrain. So let's do some comparisons. You don't need to do the comparisons, but I want to show you this. I'm going to turn off my X and I'll turn off my Y coordinates. So we're only looking at this surface. And in the interest of seeing this a little bit better, I'm going to go ahead and change this surface color like that. So you can just see it a little bit better. Okay. So as we look at it, especially on the ridge, for example, we can see the leftover pieces of those triangles. Likewise, in the valley here, we can see the leftovers of those triangles. It's not really smooth. So we have the opportunity to rebuild this surface multiple times and thereby smooth it out. And again, we're dealing with large pieces of terrain, so a little bit of smoothing is not going to hurt anything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this layer, this terrain layer, which is going to give me a copy, and I'm going to change the color of the copy to a different color. And we should now see, oh, I need to make a copy of this layer, so I'm going to type copy and then I for in place, and then we'll change it to be on this next layer here. That gives me a green copy. And I'm going to do this 3 times just so you can see the progression. So let me just create a new layer. We'll call this terrain 3. And while I'm here, I'm going to create another layer called terrain 4. And again, this is not something you're doing. It's just for my illustration purposes. So let me take the surface. We're going to copy it. I for in place, and then we'll change it onto terrain 3. And then we're going to copy it again, in place, and we'll change it onto terrain 4. And I'm going to change the color of each of these. So we'll do a reddish one, and we'll do a purple one. Okay, so what I have here is I have 2 identical copies right now. I have my terrain, my original, and then I have this first one, this terrain 1 layer. So if I were to take this green one and I were to rebuild it again, so remember our last rebuild was at 200 by 200. This time I'm going to rebuild it at 100 by 100. And when I rebuild it at 100 by 100, I'll turn off that the original for just a second, and we can look at that ridge. So it still has a little bit of lumpiness to the ridge, but if we compare it to where we were, there was our original, we can see how much smoother it is. Any place that you see gray is where it's kind of smoothed out the terrain. So our gray is much bumpier than our green. So we've eliminated some of the bumpiness. So let's move on. Let's turn the green one off and we'll rebuild this pink one. So I'll go back to rebuild again. And this time we're going to rebuild it at 50 by 50. And we'll say, okay. And so now if we compare it, let me turn back on that original, you can see that we're getting a lot smoother. So there was my original with the lumps along the ridge. And now this ridge is almost perfectly smooth. There's a little bit left, but it's awfully reasonable when it comes to smoothness. We're getting the detail we want, but not the artifacting. Now we could take this a step further and come all the way down here to number 4, and we could rebuild this at, say, 10 by 10. We'll go ahead and say, okay. And you'll see that now it got way smoother. But we're also starting to lose a lot of the detail. So my ridge that was right here, which was fairly smooth in terrain 3, I've lost a bunch of dirt from the ridge, so to speak, because it's gotten very, very smooth. Likewise, the middle of this valley is also very, very smooth. So this is probably the extreme example. I don't think I would go this far. Somewhere between the 100 and the 50, maybe a 75, one of those is about right for what you're going to work with. Okay, I'm going to leave the green one, the terrain 3 on. There you go. Oh, excuse me, the pinkish reddish one, because I think this was about the right. This was a rebuild at 50. This is giving me about the right amount of terrain left. So there it is. So now this surface is a Rhino surface. It's fundamentally a NURBS surface. So it's defined by math rather than a series of triangles. And so I can start to manipulate and work with this like any other surface. And that's where we're ultimately going. So over the next couple of days, we're going to work on this surface and manipulate it, or we'll start at the beginning and go through this process again. Before we do that, though, I'm going to cut this as if there was a series of topographic lines. So I'll make another layer here. This is layer 4. I'm going to call this Topo Lines. And I'm going to do the contour again. But this time when I do the contour, so I'll go up to Curve, Curve from Objects, and then Contour. My contour isn't going to be in the X direction. It isn't going to be in the Y direction. It's going to be in the Z direction. So let me select my objects for contour. And you guys have seen this on a map. I'm sure you've seen like a USGS contour map. That's what this is. So I've selected it. I'll select this corner as my starting point. But rather than go in the X or in the Y, or excuse me, I guess this is the Y and this is the X, I want to make sure I'm going up in the Z. So I'll switch my view into either the front or the right side view, and I'll make sure that I'm going straight up and down. Now, a traditional contour is set at 40 feet for USGS, so let's go ahead and do 40 feet. I'll type in 40 and then apostrophe, and I'll hit enter, and you'll see that it'll build a contour map of my terrain. And there it is. So at minimum, this is what I'm looking for you to turn in for Canvas for today's exercise. So I have it there. I'm going to do a screen capture of it. So I'll click the little triangle next to perspective. I'm going to come down to capture to file, and I'll save this. And say, okay, save it into today's folder. And I'm just going to call this Topo Lines. And that would be what I would turn in as our exercise. But we can take this a step further. And from here, this is just an optional step. We'll eventually go this direction, but just for practice, I'm going to make these flat. So rather than be in 3-dimensional space, I'll use this last layer here. We'll call this Topo Flat. And I will project those down onto a surface that I'm creating. So the surface has to be larger than my terrain. There it is. Then I will jump into my top view, because remember, I have to be perpendicular when I do a projection. And I'll type in project. And it asks what I want to project onto. I want to project onto that surface. I'll hit enter. And it will take those lines that are in 3 dimensions and it'll turn them perfectly flat. So essentially what I've created here is I've created a map based on that surface. So these are now perfectly flat. So it's just a different way of looking at it. We're going to manipulate these and work with these a lot more, but I wanted to show you this whole process. We could, of course, export these as an AutoCAD file. If we wanted to get them over into AutoCAD, you can select them and go to File, Export Selected. I think I mentioned that in the exercise. We're not turning this part in, so it's not really necessary. But since we're here, I'll show you that. We can go to AutoCAD Drawing and then save it wherever we want. Okay. So my purpose for you guys today is to get to the stage where we have the contour lines showing on the terrain. And you're going to do a screen capture of those contour lines to have gotten to that stage. If you get it to be flat, great. You could do a screen capture of that as well. So let's, why did my topo lines not turn on? Nah. They got put on the wrong layer. Select those really quick, get them on the correct layer. There we go. Let's change that color to white. I'll show up a little bit more on that. There you go. And so I could do a screen capture of both of these together. So I could go here and go to capture and then to file, and I could capture both of them together and post that. Either one of those is perfectly acceptable for me. So that's our end goal for today. I apologize that SketchUp didn't want to work. I will sort out what the problem is and why it's not letting me log in. And hopefully next class we'll take it all the way from SketchUp through. Okay. So you will have your next assignment. I'll give you that before next class on Monday. And that way you can start thinking about how it is that we're working. For that assignment, we do a lot of the work in class. So we'll work together on it. And I also suspect that our check-ins will start to get more important as some of these things start to get more complicated and you'll need more one-on-one help or small group help. So for those of you that haven't come to check in this week, please stick around and do check-in. We'll take a quick break. We'll start back up, let's say at 12:20 and with the first check-in group. And thank you guys all for coming. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Professor.
You bet.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.